Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and we're back with another episode of answering your offset guitar questions, which is basically a Q&A in which I've asked the community on both YouTube as well as Instagram to submit questions that they have related to offsets, and I will do my best based on personal experience to answer them. So we're going to jump right into it, starting with a question from Stephen B130 here on YouTube. Are mastery bridges an improvement over the vintage bridge? And I think for the needs of many players who are playing heavier music, maybe don't want to use heavier gauge strings, want more sustain out of their Jazzmasters or Jaguars, the mastery bridge is undoubtedly going to be an improvement. The vintage bridge here has long been often maligned by folks as being a terrible bridge, namely because of issues with strings jumping out, because there aren't actually, saddle grooves or slots for your strings. They require heavier gauge strings, usually 11s and above. And you also want to have an appropriate angle in the neck pocket so that your neck pitches back and you're able to then increase the height of the bridge so that you have the appropriate amount of string tightness, right? So that the guitar feels good and that you have lower action. And on top of that, people often complain about awful noises coming from these bridges, whether that be, sympathetic vibrations behind the bridge that people just do not want to deal with, or even rattles and buzzes coming from the various set screws, right? Because we have set screws to adjust the radius of the saddles on this bridge, as well as the height adjustment set screws in the bridge post. All of those things, unfortunately, can come loose over time. Using Loctite purple is my personal preference. That helps to solve those issues of those little set screws moving around. But yeah, the mastery bridge is a completely different modern construction. If you haven't seen what the mastery bridge is, then you've probably been living under a rock or are brand new to offsets. The mastery, by comparison, is a modern two-saddle design, which is compensated, in which you can then adjust those for pretty decent intonation. It gives you more warmth and more sustain because there is no gap. It's a non-rocking bridge, right? So it's stationary, so the bridge posts completely fill up the thimbles and there is no gap, there's no rocking, and that then increases the sustain of the bridge. The saddles themselves are also plated brass, so it gives you a warmer, a more musical tone for a lot of folks. And then on top of that, you do not need to worry about all the other common issues, such as these strings jumping out, and you can use your lighter gauge strings to your heart's content. And yeah, so depending on your needs, definitely the mastery bridge can be a drastic improvement over the vintage one. Now, folks will definitely argue that a well set up vintage bridge is a totally viable bridge. And for me, undoubtedly, there's no other bridge out there that can replicate the sound of the original vintage bridge. And I will say that the vibrato playing experience when you have a properly set up rocking vintage bridge is also just really, really smooth, very dynamic feeling, because your strings, rather than gliding over the saddles, are instead pulling it back and forth. And the overall energy and characteristic of the interplay between the vibrato and your bridge and your strings is totally different. Almost the best way that I can put it is that it's just more fluid. And some folks just appreciate the tone of that vintage bridge. It harkens back to that long gone era of the late 50s into the 60s. And it does not, by design, have a ton of sustain. It's got a more kind of percussive attack to it. And I've personally found that no other bridge out there quite does the kind of top end sparkle that these vintage bridges do when it comes to kind of the high end or the treble side of the sound of a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar. So yeah, it depends on your needs, but I think for a lot of folks, the Mastery is undoubtedly a huge improvement. Now, on the heels of that question, we've got one from Richard Marsh, 6120. Where exactly are you supposed to apply Loctite to avoid bridge rattling and all of the various moving parts on this bridge, right? All of those set screws to adjust the radius of each one of those saddles, the intonation screws, as well as the bridge height adjustment screws that are in the bridge post are all places that you do want to apply a bit of Loctite. Again, as a result of community feedback and tips, a while back, I switched over to Loctite Purple. That is Loctite 222, and I find that that just does just as good of a job with regards to preventing those screws from recessing in or the saddles lowering themselves over time. It also gets rid of those annoying rattles and vibrations, but at the same time, it's not as strong as Loctite 242 Blue, which is what most of the community has recommended over the years. And I just find that if you kind of put even a little bit too much of that Loctite 242 on those set screws or even the intonation screws, it makes them very, very hard to adjust. Whereas the purple variant is much easier. It's perfectly adjustable, but at the same time, again, solves all those unwanted issues that you get from these vintage style bridges. When I am applying Loctite, I typically have used just a Q-tip to drip a bit, and then we'll run that Q-tip down just one side of all of those screws. When it comes to the intonation screws, I don't typically completely pull these screws out. I either will completely tighten or loosen them to the end of those screws and then just apply a little bit of that Loctite again using a Q-tip just to keep the mess down. And Loctite isn't very expensive, so I don't really worry about wasting too much of it. You can get a huge bottle of it for about 15 bucks. So yeah, that's typically the way that I apply it. A little goes a long way as far as Loctite goes, especially if the only kind that you've got or have available is that blue variant. Just be very, very careful. Also, not to get any of it in the place where your Allen wrench or your hex key is supposed to go because it becomes incredibly difficult to get out, and it will make it feel like your set screws are stripped, which nobody wants. So yeah, apply it with caution, but it definitely works a treat with regards to solving those common problems. The next question here comes from Ace E5044, and they ask, what is the best affordable hard case for an offset? So for me, the most well-known hard case are the ones that have come with Fender's vintage reissue guitars over the years. Those have been the G&G made cases, which are, you know, fairly high quality. They've also done the classic series hard cases, which come standard on like the Troy Van Leeuwen, and those are the same cases that have come on the classic 60s Lacquer Jaguar and Jazzmasters that they have put out a couple years back. And those ones are kind of G&G style, but for me, those wooden cases are quite heavy. They don't really, you know, secure your guitar very well inside of the case. There's quite a bit of play. So my personal favorite case and ones that I've seen going for fairly cheap are the deluxe molded, Jazzmaster Jaguar case. Those are the ones that come stock with the American Pro Jazzmaster and Jaguar models. And I've been seeing them going on eBay for, you know, as cheap as $125 sometimes. Keep an eye out on, Franklin Guitar Works, for example. They often are selling them either as auctions or even buy it now for that cheap. So I feel like if you can find one in that price range, that is probably the best case. And on top of it, despite their size and how well they protect your offsets, because they are made of an ABS material, it's more of like a flight case, but it's quite lightweight to carry by comparison to those old G&G and also classic series wooden cases. I don't have much experience with the Gator cases and the Roadrunner cases and all of that, so I can't speak to those. So for me, personally, I feel like those deluxe molded Fender, Jazzmaster, and Jaguar cases are the best. The next question here comes from Siegfried Hecker 3473. And he asks, what's the most common non-standard thing your clients ask for, such as mods or finish colors? And I would say probably the most asked for thing that I get from clients is to add the series tone option to their Jaguars. And it's very easy. You don't actually need to even add any new like electronics. You just have to rewire it so that when it's done, basically turns your independent neck and bridge pickup switches, when turned to the off position, now becomes both pickups in series, and it is a heavenly tone, a creamy tone, and thicker with more mid-range. Essentially turns both of your pickups into a giant humbucker, and it sounds so crisp and such a great both rhythm and lead guitar tone when combined with the strangle switch. That option comes standard on the Johnny Marr Jaguars, and is something that folks have been doing on their Jaguars for many years now. So that definitely is the most requested one. The second most requested one is for Johnny Marr Jaguars, and that is to turn the second series only bass cut or strangle switch into a reverse phase or an out of phase switch, which gives you kind of those Strat in between type out of phase tones, that quacky kind of funky sound. And I've done that on my personal Johnny Marr Jaguars, and I love that tone too. Just gives me some different flavors on tap. And so yeah, those are probably the most common things that folks ask me to do. User 57186 asks, which artist or band influenced you directly to play offsets? And boy, this was a hard one because there's so many good options. And I think after some serious consideration, I'm definitely going to have to go with Mr. Steven Seagal. If you didn't know, this dude is a big guitar collector, and from that badass tiny ponytail that he's got to his crazy vintage Jazzmaster collection, I think it's going to have to be, Steven. It's going to have to be Steven. Now, I know that's not the kind of answer you were actually probably looking for. I would have to say truly the most influential guitar player for me personally that has played offsets has got to be Stephen Malkmus from Pavement. Stephen Malkmus and the Jigs. He's got that beautiful vintage Olympic white Jazzmaster. And I remember when I first caught wind of him playing one of those. Back then, all I had owned was a Telecaster. Jazzmasters weren't as common to find back in the the early 2000s at your typical guitar shops like Guitar Center and Sam Ash. And on top of that, they were very, very expensive. But I'd say, yeah, Malkmus, between his speak, sing, swagger, and his also just kind of like laid back, effortless kind of guitar playing, is definitely something that to this day I aspire to kind of embody. All right, so the next question comes from Inland Bot. Not specifically offset related, but could you talk a bit about your thoughts on full pocket versus partial neck shims and what causes the dreaded ski slope? Oh man. Getting into this again, huh? if you're interested, I made a video at the very beginning, one of my earliest YouTube videos, called Why Full Pocket Neck Shims Suck. I have very, very strong opinions on those, just based on my experience from the past, almost 16 years working on guitars and also owning and playing offset guitars specifically. And yeah, I just find that the full pocket neck shims, those that are made by StewMac, and also the cheaper variants that you can even get from Amazon, just kind of suck the liveliness and the acoustic resonance of these guitars. The ones that I feel are the biggest offenders are the 1 degree size shims. Those are the thickest ones that are usually available. And the results when comparing against even using the same amount of thickness in the inner neck pocket, just using cardstock, is pretty drastic. And the whole reason that I even made this discovery is I had a number of clients over the past 2-3 years specifically that were bringing me their offsets and just telling me that after a setup from otherwise very reputable techs, that their guitars just sounded a lot less lively, a lot more kind of deadened and dampened than before. And sure enough, the common change that had happened to these guitars is that the techs had put in a full pocket neck shim. I had also experimented with them too and didn't at first notice that huge of a difference, but I also wasn't using the 1 degree size. I was using more of the 0.25 or 0.5, and those ones are not as apparent. But again, the thicker the full pocket shim, the more kind of deadened the results would be. And it was curious to find that switching back to just normal old cardstock, or even more recently, I've been using Curtis Novak's remakes of those old fiberboard shims that Fender used to use back in the 60s. And those somehow are able to retain all of the liveliness and acoustic resonance that for some folks is very, very important to them. The unplugged acoustic tone of their electric guitars. It may seem silly to some folks out there, but it is important to some. And obviously, as a guitar tech, I do have to cater to my clients' needs. So this was just a strange discovery. Now, most people, use those full pocket neck shims, not because they just want to spend a bunch of money on thin slivers of wood, but because they have read on the internet that the partial neck shims, or the inner pocket neck shims, as I like to call them, or short shims, some people call them, are the cause of a phenomenon known as ski jump. Hayes Guitars famously has written articles on this where basically they have posited that the inner pocket neck shims cause a slope at the very, very end of the neck, right? Which then requires usually invasive procedures to fix, many of them being very costly, requiring like full refrets, planing of the fretboards and whatnot. And so folks rightfully are scared that that is going to happen on their guitars if they just use, cardstock or whatever. But again, in the past, 15, 16 years that I've done dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of guitars for folks, no one's ever come back to me and told me that the inner pocket neck shims that I installed on their guitars, over a decade ago, have developed this. At the same time, ski jump is also something that is developed on guitars that are not bolt-ons, right? There's this huge thread over on Talk Bass where a bunch of luthiers have chimed in. Again, watch my full video on this topic because kind of covers more and does more of a deep dive into it. But yeah, they found that even on guitars like Gibsons and Gretches and those, set neck guitars develop ski jump as well. Hayes Guitars actually added an addendum article to this after talking to one of the luthiers that had contributed to that Talk Bass article, and has kind of, revised his statement on it kind of being up in the air whether or not the shims are the actual cause of this. But for those many, many luthiers that have contributed to that conversation, it definitely was not that. And Hayes Guitars also clarifies that what a lot of those luthiers were talking about was more of something called the 12th fret hump, kind of here from the 12th fret to where the body meets the neck. You develop kind of a hump over there. And so he chalked it up to potentially also being miscommunication or people using the term ski jump to describe two different phenomenons related to the neck. So yeah, but me, from personal experience, again, I've never had any issues. Even, those old AVRI guitars or vintage guitars, very rarely have any of those come to me and had that very issue. So again, for me, the inner pocket neck shims, I just use cardstock at home. That's the way that Fender was doing it on their AVRI 62s when they finally began to reissue Jazzmasters and Jaguars. They just used like a stack of maybe like 3 or 4 pieces of cardstock or cardboard even that measured about, the same size as that 1 degree shim. And yeah, I've never seen that phenomenon happen on any of those. So for me personally, I don't worry about it, but for you, definitely take that with a grain of salt and proceed with whatever level of caution is appropriate to the amount of fear you have of that phenomenon happening on your guitar. All right, we're going to move on now to questions submitted by the community over on Instagram. And this question comes from Duoskiro. Is a Duosonic an offset? And that is a really, really good question, because I think a lot of folks are under the assumption that the Duosonic is, but you'd be surprised to find that no, despite looking very much like a Mustang, the Duosonic is not an offset. For a guitar to be considered an offset guitar, these kind of the waist of the guitar, the contour here, does need to be offset. And you can see that here at the top and down here at the bottom is offset slightly. It's at an angle here, and it was designed this way to make it easier to play these guitars sitting down. This was first featured, I believe, on the Jazzmaster back in 1958, because the Jazzmaster was intended for jazz players who often play sitting down, and then was also applied to many other of their designs: the Jazz Bass, the Jaguar, the Mustang, the Marauder, the Electric 12, the Bass 6, and so on and so forth. And so yeah, the Duosonic, because the waist of that is not offset and they align perfectly, right, going this way, just like a Strat, then the Duosonic is not an offset. The next question comes from Kevin C. The R on my AVRI Jaguar decal is peeling off. Should I buy the StewMac Nitro pen to fix it? Now, I cannot really speak to that. I've never used the StewMac Nitro pen personally for that purpose. For me, so if you don't know, these vintage reissue guitars come with the decal sitting on top of the finish, right? These are often nitro finish necks. This is an AV65 neck right here. And if you can see, maybe if I angle it in the light, or you can just take my word for it, this decal is applied right to the top over the finish. And so I don't think that I personally would use a nitro pen. If anything, like when applying decals to guitars, I typically will make like a water and glue solution. So maybe you could just even take, I could see using the clear Elmer's school glue, just watered down, and then just apply it underneath, and then just I would then just flatten it with my fingertips, and then dab out the remaining water that is surrounding it, and then within a couple minutes, that's going to dry. And that stuff is water soluble, so that you can easily get rid, if it left any, glue marks, you can just use a little bit of naphtha to wipe away any excess that might have ended up on your headstock. And there you go. I think that should solve your issue without having to buy that StewMac Nitro pen. And I would also be worried that potentially the Nitro lacquer in that pen could potentially make the decal like curl up. I don't know. That's just an assumption that I'm making. So I probably would stay away from that and just do what I just mentioned. All right, the next question comes from Hatman. Do you ever use the mute, or do you think it's pointless? I do use the mute on Jaguars where I have the mute installed. Obviously, it's not a requirement to make your Jaguar cool or whatever, but it's a fun little novelty. I will say that. It's definitely useful, and you play different and can get different tones using it. And it does sound a bit different than just normal palm muting right at the bridge. I think it's got kind of a plucky kind of sound, or sounds really, really cool with fuzz and delay pedals, or whatever kind of effects that you like to use. And I think it just adds to your overall sonic palette, and I find it quite fun. This one comes from Brand Fuzzle. What do you think of the 60s classic Lacquer Jazzmaster made in Mexico? And these were guitars that were released in the earlier 2010s, and I think they continued to make them maybe up until 2016 or 2018. They were supposed to be Fender Mexico's kind of equivalent to the American vintage reissue, with early 60s styling on these. Now, in my personal opinion, despite the fact that on paper, with their pure vintage 65 pickups and all of their like good electronics and all of that stuff, and the fact that they were finished in nitro, they were not the MIM AVRI equivalent that a lot of folks who I think probably have never actually played American vintage reissue 62 guitars assumed that they were. In fact, I found them to be quite lacking in a lot of details. One of the most frustrating things about that series of guitars for me personally is they came with a vibrato without the lock button. To me, they felt just as janky as the vibratos that come on the Squire Vintage Modified and Classic Vibe offsets. And for some reason, I do not know why, Fender changed like the CNC plans, and the routes for the vibrato were ever slightly too small for an AVRI vibrato to drop in without catching on the walls of that vibrato route. And so nobody wants to have to take a router or a Dremel to their guitar to fix something that should be factory standard. So that was definitely an annoyance. And then moreover, I found that even folks who used like bodies for those guitars to build out parts casters on top of the folks who had these complaints about them stock also noticed that they just were kind of dead and dampened sounding guitars. They didn't have, again, that kind of like liveliness and acoustic resonance that you would find on the more premium American vintage reissues. And I'm not sure if they were just using like lesser quality wood. I did notice, for example, on the Jazzmasters that the tummy cut contour was not at all very deep. In fact, it was quite shallow to be vintage spec. And so maybe they were just using like lesser cuts of alder for those, or maybe they went ham with the poly undercoat for them, which resulted in a kind of deader overall feel and sound to those guitars. And yeah, also this happens on a lot of guitars, but more often than not, when those guitars would come in for service, they would have some pretty severe fret sprout. And so they often would then require at minimum a fret end dressing and polish. And so, yeah, all of those kind of fit and finish issues make them, kind of, not a go-to recommendation for me. Now, if you do find one cheap, for $1,000 or less, they definitely are pretty good guitars, so long as you are willing to give them the attention that they need to address all of those issues that I just outlined. But I do see folks that are asking, crazy money for for those guitars, on Reverb and eBay, and yeah, I definitely would not spend any more than probably $1,100 or $1,200 on one of those, especially if you are not someone that knows how to do their own guitar work. The next question comes from Ian Dr. Vu on Instagram, and he asks, can you elaborate on how the trem lock system works with examples? So basically, the reason why the trem lock was included on the original design of the offset vibrato featured on Jazzmasters and Jaguars was that if you were to break a string, whether that be on stage or maybe in the studio or at rehearsal or whatever, that if it was properly calibrated, you could then easily engage that lock. And the lock engaged means that the lock button is oriented away from your bridge, and you know that it's locked because you can't pull up on the vibrato. Right now, it's not locked on this Jazzmaster, okay? And if I lock that button, and on this one, it is properly calibrated, I need to now engage the lock by just ever so slightly pushing down on the vibrato arm. And now that it's locked, I cannot pull this vibrato arm up at all, okay? To properly calibrate it, definitely check out some of my previous videos, such as the ultimate guide to setting up a Fender Jaguar. That's in there. But basically what you want to do is you want to find the midpoint when adjusting the tension spring here, okay? You want to find the midpoint between being able to lock the guitar without first depressing the arm and not being able to lock it without first being able to depress the arm. And so a half turn on that spring tension screw counterclockwise, aka loosening it, would result in you being able to lock the lock without first depressing the arm. And then a half turn clockwise would result in you not being able to lock it without depressing the arm. And so that is how I know that I have calibrated perfectly to my string gauge. Again, watch that Jaguar setup guide for more info on that, because I go more in depth into how to actually do that. Additionally, despite the fact that that is how I learned how to calibrate it, definitely check out the guide by my buddy Che Choi, Lounging Guitars. He's got a different way to calibrate the vibrato and set the spring tension so that the lock is working properly. So definitely check out his channel to find out his version of doing that kind of setup. All right, so the next question comes from Dang Noises. Should I try flat wounds on one of my Jazzmasters or Jaguars? And I would say at least once in your lifetime as a Jaguar and Jazzmaster owner, definitely try flat wounds on one of them, because if you are longing for that vintage tone, it will immediately transport you back. This Jaguar here that I built for my brother has flat wound strings. These are just chromes, I believe 11 to 50s on here, and it just nails that vintage sound. It's just warm, right? And it's more percussive sounding. The string tension is a bit tighter, especially on the Dario chromes. These are famously known for just their very, very smooth feel in comparison to a lot of the other lower price flat wound sets like the GHS ones or the DR or even Ernie Ball flats. And yeah, they're just got that again, that vintage tone, especially if you are playing kind of jazzier or more mellow kind of music. I really, really love a set of flat wounds. And if you have multiples of any type of guitar, Jazzmaster, Jaguar, Mustang, what have you. Definitely try flatwounds on them, because that is the kinds of strings that these guitars originally came with back when they were first released. And they are the string of choice for these original vintage threaded saddle bridges. They have no issues with regards to jumping out of these saddles despite not having these slots. And yeah, just a heavenly, warm, vintage kind of tone. Definitely try them out. All right, my friends, I think we're going to have to call it for this installment of episode 2. We will be back next week with the rest of the questions, and you're definitely going to want to tune in, because there are a lot more interesting questions that people ask related to our favorite offset style guitars. If you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell, to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars answers to your offset questions.